Please admit our witness. Mr. Browne, welcome. Thank you. Sorry for keeping you waiting. We've just been rounding up the troops again. Can I say thank you for appearing before the committee today to give evidence. Please note that the committee staff will be taking photos, but also videos during the hearing. These may be used on the Legislative Assembly's social media page. Please let the committee staff know if you object to having photos and videos taken. Before we start, do you have any questions about the hearing process?
No, thank you.
Thank you. As part of the formalities, can you please take the oath or make an affirmation? And I understand these have been emailed to you.
I, William Browne, do hereby affirm and declare that the evidence I shall give before this committee shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Would you like to make a short opening statement before we begin with questions?
Yes, thank you, and thank you for having me here today. Truth in political advertising laws have operated in South Australia since the 1980s and were adopted unanimously by the ACT Legislative Assembly in 2020. The Australia Institute's polling research finds that such laws are overwhelmingly popular among voters of all stripes. Truth in political advertising laws are not a silver bullet, but they do nip misleading campaigns in the bud and have done so even in the fast pace of an election campaign. Moving on to political finance laws in New South Wales, these favour established parties and incumbents in several ways. Election campaign funding is calculated based on prior elections. Administrative funding is based on MPs in Parliament. MLAs enjoy incumbency advantages of over $2 million per electoral cycle. Donation caps are higher for parties than for candidates, and spending caps allow parties to pile in to target seats. The effect is that established parties and incumbent MPs don't need to raise as much money and experience fewer limits on the money that they do raise at the expense of a level playing field. Donation and spending caps and public funding laws in New South Wales were well intentioned, but their effect has been to reduce democratic competition and to insulate parties from consequences of declining membership. I recommend the committee investigate how to make campaign finance laws in New South Wales fairer. An accidental benefit of these changes could be to encourage parties to re-engage with potential members and volunteers. Finally, I should note that my submission gives as an example of the limitations of political finance disclosures that New South Wales Labor political expenditures for 2022-23 are not available. When I checked this week, they were available, as were others. I believe this was true at the time I wrote it, but if that was my error, I apologise, and I've submitted a corrected submission. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, any questions?
Yeah, Chair. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Nanva.
Thank you for your time this afternoon. I just want to turn to your submission and the issue around the incumbency advantage that you write of. There remains strong cross-party support for the principle that was articulated by Premier Keneally in 2010 when introducing the Election Funding and Disclosures Amendment Bill, which is the precursor to today's Act, that these reforms are about putting a limit on the political arms race under which those with the most money have the loudest voice and can simply drown out the voices of all others. You would agree that money should not be the sole determinant to candidacy success, and in fact is not always the main determinant of the success of candidacies.
Yes, I'd agree with both of those statements.
Would you agree that there is no circumstance where the spectacle of millions of dollars being spent on individual seats by individual candidates, whether self-funded or funded by third parties, is an election system we should welcome in New South Wales?
I think what we want is to have a level playing field where voters are presented with as much choice as possible and where candidates are able to compete with each other in a way that isn't affected by whether they're coming from an established party or they're an independent candidate or they're part of a new party. I think part of the problem with focusing on political expenditures per se is that it misses the enormous unwritten benefits that some candidates go into an election with. And some of the spending that we see is an attempt to overcome the existing benefits that MPs have. So it's not a like-for-like comparison necessarily.
Your submission goes into some detail into the incumbency advantages of major parties and incumbents. I'm interested in your balanced thoughts about whether there are competing disadvantages for major political parties and sitting incumbents. I'm sure you would agree that major parties are forced to appeal or respond to electors on a number of different issues, not single issues, that they have multiple agendas, multiple points of campaigning, and far more ground to cover. That takes more resources than it would for an independent candidate in a single seat.
It certainly can do. The parties have obligations that go outside of election campaigning. And in some of our work with the Victorian laws, we've collected examples of the contributions that political parties make to our democracy. And when that includes something like giving a policy voice to members, that is kind of a unique party feature. Parties do tend to run, major parties, in all or most seats. The size of the campaigns does vary dramatically, and there's some evidence in the submission to that, although much of it is not completely known. But I think it's a very difficult comparison to make, in part because parties do also get network effects and overflow effects. So a campaign in one seat reaps benefits in adjoining seats as well, for example.
I do agree with some of your, not all of your concerns, but some of your concerns around the incumbency advantage. The Act contemplates that and has a number of measures within it to ameliorate those. Would you agree that independent candidates are more likely to run in areas where there is significant organic dissatisfaction with an incumbent MP or a major political party?
That could be the case, but I don't think it necessarily has to be. And I think ideally it would be possible to run a campaign in any seat. You shouldn't have to wait until dissatisfaction grows to be greater than the state average, for example, before such a campaign becomes viable. People should be able to join the contest of ideas in every electorate.
What is your view about the mechanisms available within the Act with respect to candidates and third parties being able to make their case for 3 years and 9 months before capped expenditure periods kick in, and third parties particularly being able to campaign during the capped expenditure period, with a cap that currently sits at $1.5 million and obviously the seat cap that sits within that? You would agree that that does moderate some of those incumbency advantages that you speak of?
I'd be interested to see how third-party spending in practice breaks down, to what extent third-party organisations are more likely to support new entrants, minor parties, independents and so on, as opposed to the major parties. I think, though, if we look at some of the successful campaigns in the past, whether that's from independents or new parties or so on, they often emerge fairly close to an election. It's really, to my mind, the established parties who have the benefit of being able to build their profile year in, year out, and much more likely that an independent candidate emerges closer to the election.
Could I perhaps put it another way, and this will be my last question, Chair. Campaign financing and campaign structuring is very different in New South Wales, and very deliberately different in New South Wales to the federal approach. Indeed, the Centre for Public Integrity has held up New South Wales as providing the best scheme in Australia on the issue of donations and spending caps. Does it better promote the principles that you have previously written of with respect to fairness, transparency and confidence in the electoral process if groups like hypothetically Climate 200 are required to campaign openly in support of candidates or issues using the third-party mechanism that is available to them under the Act in New South Wales? Or does it meet those fairness, transparency principles if, as is the case federally, they are able to provide funds uncapped directly to candidates where some voters may not have that information awareness of that financial contribution?
I think it's difficult to compare two jurisdictions, both of which need to improve in many ways, and transparency is lacking at the federal level in particular. We, among others, have identified ways that more donations should be disclosed, for example. But I don't think there's, in principle, a problem with donation aggregators operating, whether that's trade unions or lobby groups or Climate 200, and doing so in the form of giving donations. At the federal level, we've suggested...
Do you believe do you believe what transpired in the last federal election where millions of dollars were spent by individual candidates in individual seats is a transparent, fair and balanced approach to an electoral system that invites competition from all political participants?
I'd like to see much more transparency about expenditure, more details about donations, both at the state and federal level. But the advantages for an incumbent MP are in the millions of dollars. So it doesn't surprise me that some campaigns will reach that size of money as well. If there's a way of overcoming those advantages while limiting the amount of spending in seats, that strikes me as ideal. I think that's something that both New South Wales and the federal parliament should be aiming towards.
Mr. Barley.
Chair, I just wish to, and thank you, Mr. Browne, for your paper and stuff. I just want to explore, like on page 9, you have a fair bit of detail analysis of what an MLA or an MLC gets paid, and you've been talking about incumbency, etc. But are you suggesting we should go back to the 1900s, where early 1900, where MPs, or even the late 1800s, no one gets paid? We had to raise money locally to send the politician to Sydney. It's just, I don't see how incumbency actually benefits that you're allowed to stay overnight. In part, like I live in Blacktown, so we finish sometimes at 3 a.m. I've got to drive home, which is an hour away, and then get up 2 hours later to come back. You know that, and I don't get allowed an overnight to stay unless I sleep on the lounge here in Parliament, and scared of cleaners in the morning. But it's essentially, I don't. Why? What's the purpose of page 9 to identify a person's salary? Like, we don't expose your salary, that what you're getting at the institute or everybody else. It's just, it's part of the job once you're elected. And the communication allowances, when we're having the debate about controversial bills, we have to communicate with our electorate to find feedback. Yes, I do get some, which I don't do. I know some MPs love putting about 50 photos of themselves cutting ribbons and selfies. But most people I find in the electorate actually throw it straight into the bin as soon as they see that. I try to go for like a baby news article, and that seems to get better feedback. So I don't understand what you're trying to get at with page 9, saying that this is part of the incumbency when it's actually once you're elected, the election's over. You're there to do a job for your community, regardless if you're an independent political party or whatever. You're there for the community. So that shouldn't be, I can't see how this adds to the incumbency benefit.
I think it can be two things at once. It can be part of the job, and in some cases a necessary part of the job. that these advantages exist and that MPs are funded. And I mean, it was a great victory for democratic representation to get parliamentarian salaries implemented to allow a greater variety of people to run for parliament and to serve. But nonetheless, the ability to put communications in front of voters in a way that's funded by the taxpayer, by the New South Wales public, is an advantage. And as you mentioned, it's one that other parliamentarians take full advantage of. Similarly, taking time off your work to campaign as a new entrant is another cost and another barrier to entry that MPs don't have to face. Travel allowance can depend greatly on the nature of the electorate, but there are large electorates where being able to travel the length and breadth of the electorate as an MP is a significant advantage, and the cost involved in matching that mobility for a challenger is not inconsequential. So the aim there is to illustrate the kind of advantages that you would want to incorporate into your calculations of spending caps, donation caps, where an MP is starting off with a head start over their rival. Not to argue that those entitlements shouldn't exist.
But at the same time, should look at the challenges, so to speak, because as an MP, the disadvantage, as my colleague Mr. Namber was just raising earlier, is that you're exposed every day in the media.
Yeah.
The political party has its principles, has its platform, yet an independent can turn up 2 minutes before the closing of nominations, have very little involvement in the community. And I notice quite often half the independents don't even know what state governments do or local councils, or they run on mixed campaigns. Is there, arguably suggesting that there needs to be some type of questionnaire that finding out whether anyone that runs actually knows what their electorate's about, because people can put up, anyone can put their name up, gets elected, and probably not service the needs of the electorate, because just because as an MP you're exposed and you suddenly, especially in marginal seats, if a party leader does slightly something not too great, and suddenly you're swept out of office. So there are changeovers of seats.
Let's see if Mr. Browne has a comment.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, so
It's supposed to be a
it's
question.
true that
It is. How do independents? How do we know what
Sorry,
independents
no,
are up to?
let's see. Sorry, I didn't hear that, Mr. Browne. Do you?
Yeah, sorry. So look, it's true that the fate of party candidates is caught up in the political party more generally. But those parties have long histories. They've got significant assets, both in terms of real capital and political capital. They start with name recognition, and in fact, MPs start with personal name recognition as well, thanks in part to the fact that they're covered seriously in the media, both positively and negatively. I don't deny that there are probably independent candidates who are unsuitable for office, but that doesn't mean that they should start off with a campaigning disadvantage, or that the deliberate intervention of the law should be to limit them in a way that party candidates aren't limited. It should be to the public and to their ability to fundraise to affect that.
Okay, can I just ask Ms. Quinnell? I know
Yes.
you have a question.
Okay, so thank you for your submission, but I do. There is nothing stopping independent members of the community getting out there and making themselves known to the community. And I feel that the idea that it's all down to the money that an incumbent has is disingenuous to the reality of being elected in an area. So I came up against an incumbent, as every new member does come up against, by definition, except for, the member for Leppington, who is the first of his kind. But
in many ways.
Every other lower house member who has been victorious in a seat comes up against an incumbent. So if it was an insurmountable mountain, then it would never ever change. It would forever be that the incumbent was there forevermore and seats would never alter. And we know that's not the case. And I suppose I just wanted a comment as to the submission, and I realise it's about political finance, but your submission infers, and we saw this was not the case in the federal election, that the amount of cash that you throw at an election is going to guarantee a result. So I would like your comments, please, on that, understanding that just because you throw lots and lots of money at a seat, that therefore you are guaranteed to win that seat. Please discuss.
Money is certainly not sufficient to decide which way a seat falls. Ultimately, that choice belongs to the voters. But there's no doubt that money and the other advantages of incumbency help, and that political parties can support candidates to dislodge incumbent MPs of other parties or indeed independent MPs, and therefore give them something of a leg up as well. Whether the playing field is level or not is decided by where the advantages lie. It doesn't have to be that it's impossible to overthrow an incumbent for us to recognise that the advantages that incumbent start with mean that it's harder than it would be all else being equal. And whether that's the ability to fundraise, name recognition, the benefits that are provided by the taxpayer to incumbent MPs, that all serves to accumulate.
Can I just go to...
Of course, yes. It was just a follow-up to say, do you acknowledge that there are rules around the funding that we are provided within this place to ameliorate some of those advantages?
Yes, and those rules can serve to limit those advantages, but nonetheless, there are things that are not directly electorally related that still increase an MP's electoral advantage. And then that can include communications that are totally within the rules, but that nonetheless increase their name recognition, give them a chance to talk directly to voters, and so on.
Ms. Saffin. You need to turn your microphone on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair. Mr. Browne, I've been listening to that whole debate. It's a complicated one because we've heard it from some independent campaigners as well, and I'm not sure how it can be resolved and exactly, if you're trying to equalise everybody, if people have got name recognition, they've got, funds to do their work, I'm not sure how it can be addressed. But from that, I just note on page 10 in your submission, and it was the second one that came through, the corrected one, you said there's no rule about political staff in New South Wales, and I'm not sure what you mean because our electorate officers are not political staff and they're very much bound by rules about what they can and can't do and what we can do. So I'd like that to be corrected, please. Thank you.
I'm certainly happy to review that and correct that if that's in error. The source there was from a discussion about where the limits of digging up dirt on opponents were. So I'll go back to that source and see what the detail was there.
Thank you.
Further questions, Mr. Haggerty?
Yeah, it's come from your submission and there have been other submissions as well about this perceived advantage that major parties have and parties have. Could it be perhaps that, to use probably a poor analogy, people take their votes very, very seriously, and consider it's like purchasing a vehicle, right? You're going to go with a trusted brand. It's a major investment. It's something important. And you said yourself, political parties have a long history, so that voters inherently will look at major party candidates because they represent a certain set of values. There is some level of trust in that party. and if they don't, if there are other candidates there that are just as appealing, they'll vote for them as well. So I just want to get the thoughts on that in fact, it's not this arms race with money and influence.
Yeah, look, I think one of the advantages that political parties give is the vetting of candidates, the development of consistent policy. The endorsement of a candidate by a party is a reasonably good indicator of that person's policies. In the Victorian submission, where we considered these issues, we made something of a distinction between the kind of advantages that may emerge organically versus those that are imposed by legislation. And one thing that our submission tries to do is demonstrate the ways in which the levers of political finance laws have been set up in a way that perhaps inadvertently disadvantages new entrants and independents. That's kind of a separate, that can be treated separately to this issue of, well, should you have an incumbency advantage going into it at all? But for example, when a new car manufacturer tries to break into a market, and it is difficult, they're not limited in the amount of money that they can spend. And similarly, new sports teams often actually get a leg up from the organising body, precisely to recognise that in a fair fight, new entrants are going to struggle.
You can comment on this if you want, but it's probably more of a comment. But I'll just make the point that we have the largest crossbench ever. It has been growing, and that is at both the state and federal, and a significant number of that crossbench are independents. Are you proposing solutions to a problem that doesn't actually exist?
So we did go a little to the backgrounds of the crossbench, and most of the crossbenchers either defected from a political party, came from local government, in one case were the endorsed successor to an existing MP. So it's true that there's a large crossbench, but much of that is actually a product of people leaving political parties rather than running as independents originally per se. I think there could very well be, well, I would draw a distinction between making sure that the level playing field is there and what the outcomes may be. We don't need to think that the crossbench should be larger or smaller to recognise that there are advantages in place for incumbents.
Thank you. Now, our final question to Mr. Borsley.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Mr. Browne, in your recommendations, point 12, you talk about political finance transparency reforms. It's quite a list of things you've got there. Do you honestly believe that this could actually be achieved, especially in relation to candidates? We got an extensive presentation from Climate 200 today talking about wanting more transparency, but also talking about fairer disclosure and distribution of income from the government, I guess, even though they said they didn't want any. The clear thing was that they were looking for funding for independents while trying to disguise their own support of those independents. How does one go about getting candidates to disclose their revenue, expenditure, loans and assets at least annually? How does that work in practice? I just can't see that, sorry.
I'd be interested in exploring what's most feasible to implement, but if we're already requiring candidates to maintain accounts, to record donations and keep track of what needs to be disclosed there, I'm not sure why that would get more difficult. It's not
You're saying at least
to,
annually, so most of them nominate, within just before the election. How does that work?
Well, I wouldn't require them to disclose things from before they're nominating unless it's pertinent to the to electoral expenditure or campaigning.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for having appeared today. You'll be provided with a copy of the transcript of your evidence for corrections. Committee staff will also email any questions taken on notice from today and any supplementary questions from the committee. Thank you very much for appearing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Visit australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest research, commentary and analysis, as well as details for upcoming events and webinars.